Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for what undoubtedly will be a great time together. This is Sinai's fourth in a series of parenting a webinar series. And tonight we'll be talking about talking to your child about their disability. Before we start, I'd like to firstly thank two people who have helped make this whole series, work technically from the back end. That's Asher Forst, a good friend of Sinai, making sure that Zoom and the webinar is going smoothly, and of course, the Abigail Hepner-Gross, our Director of Communications, whose brainchild this was, and who made this happen from beginning to end. So thank you both. We're joined tonight, or I am joined tonight, by Mrs. Gitti Rothschild. Gitti is the director of Sinai at YCQ, at Yeshiva of Central Queens. Gitti and I have the pleasure of working together closely in lots of projects, and including many of the conversations that we have together with parents about just this, about helping them figure out how to best speak to their children about their disability, about if they should, when they should, how they should. And so we hope to be covering some of that with you tonight. I guess I'll just start with saying that each child is a world unto their own. I can tell you that at Sinai, we have 210 students. Every one of those students is a world unto his or her own. And so when we're talking about in generalities, like we will be tonight, about how to speak to your children about their disability, obviously what applies to one child isn't necessarily what applies to another child, or what would work in one family may not work in another. And so we'll be sharing with you tonight some of what we've learned over the years and what we think is good practice. But of course, it's not prescriptive in that way. And as we will go over a number of times during tonight's presentation, it's always good to speak with a professional, an educator, a mental health professional, somebody who's been there and knows you and your child and your family to be able to guide you the best that we could. But having said that, we hope to share with you some guidelines, some thoughts that we've learned over over the years to hopefully help guide you. So let's get right into it. Speaking to a child about their disability is something that I think a lot of parents are concerned about, rightfully so, in the sense that they want to do it right. They don't want to say something wrong that stigmatizes them in their own eyes, that makes them feel badly about themselves, or say something too early or too late. And so this whole conversation comes with a lot of care and a lot of thought, and as it should. But I hope what we'll be able to share tonight is that it's actually not so complicated, right? If you just think about 2, 3, 4 different kinds of guidelines and thoughts, then really we should be able to figure this out together as a team, and that's our goal. So why don't we start like this? Mrs. Rothschild, just talking very globally, what are some of the considerations that parents should think about when they're considering whether or not to speak to their child about their disability?
I think that one thing that people have to take into account is the nature of the disability, the nature of the diagnosis, what type of implication that's going to have on the child in the future. The child's age, the child's level of functioning. There are several, like you said, there are a few different factors that you need to take into consideration. I guess the place that I want to start is it important to actually use the label, the name of the diagnosis, versus a description of what the child is going through and the difficulties a child might be facing? Is it really important to put a name to that diagnosis? And like you said, Rabbi Rothwachs, the answer is going to be, it depends. It's every child is an individual, and sometimes it's not important. Sometimes the child does not have the context to understand the diagnosis. They don't understand the words that we're using. They don't understand the specific diagnosis and its implications. And so they don't actually need to know the word, the name of it. I would say that there are, on the other hand, go ahead. You look like you want to jump in.
No, I was just gonna argue that that might be true of us, adults as well. Oftentimes when I'm speaking with prospective parents and I'm asking them about their child and tell me a little bit about their strengths and their challenges, and at a certain point in the conversation, I'll ask, are there any diagnoses? And sometimes there is and sometimes there isn't, but I'll always say it really doesn't matter that much, right? It helps me as a professional to understand how somebody else thought about this child and maybe things that we could expect. But really what matters, right? What a diagnosis is, autism, Down syndrome, a learning disability, any of those terms is just a way to help people, make sense of a certain set of circumstances. And so really what's important is, what are those circumstances, right? What are the things that you're really good at? What are the things that you really struggle with? And so, I would agree with you that there are times that, it's helpful to use the label of the diagnosis, but oftentimes it's not what it's about. And just before I hand it back to you, I realized there's one thing I forgot to say in the beginning, which was that there will be time at the end for question and answers. So you'll see on the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. So if you do have a question, feel free to input it there at any time, and we'll try to leave time at the end of the webinar for questions. But right back to you, Mrs. Rothschild, about the labels versus descriptions, diagnoses versus challenges. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, the other piece to it is what you just said, which is the label is just a label. You and I have both seen children with the same label who present very differently from each other. So again, the label is just a label, but I would argue the flip side also, because there are times when it's important to know the word for it. I'll give you an example. Sometimes if you're communicating, if a child is communicating with someone and needs to explain, think about an example of a medical diagnosis. Think about how much more effective a communicator you are if you can say, this is the issue, this is what I'm struggling with. And the professional then understands where the starting point is. So there might be a point where having a label is actually empowering and actually allows the person to get the help that they need. But again, like I said, it's going to depend. At what point should you introduce that label? Is it always necessary? And these are some of the things we're going to explore tonight.
Yeah, it's also helpful, again, in the later years when the children have a little bit more control over their destiny and advocacy and all of those things. It's helpful to know your diagnosis, to know who to connect with, and to certainly as an adult to know which support groups you may want to look out for, or to be able to articulate what's on your mind with a professional. So I think we could all appreciate that as an adult. That's helpful, and as a 3-year-old, it's not helpful. And so the question really tonight is, when and how do we navigate that? So that's exactly right. I think we started earlier tonight talking a little bit about anxiety around this whole conversation and the stress around not wanting to do this wrong. I think that parents often come to me with this kind of conversation, and they're so worried that by talking about the disability with their child, not necessarily sharing a diagnosis, but even saying that this is hard for you, this is a challenge, that it will damage their self-esteem in some way. And I could understand that. I could, I identify with that as a parent. But at the same time, we have to be able to take a step back and say, really, the truth is that when done correctly, and we'll talk about tonight what that means, that really you're doing the exact opposite. Instead of protecting them from the unknown and potentially damaging their self-esteem, you're actually empowering them with knowledge, and then the ability when they can one day to advocate for themselves and to understand their own place in the world.
Yeah. I would tell you that addressing that anxiety and that stress that you're describing, very often children notice that they are different from their friends or their siblings, especially if they attend a different school, they get additional support services, and they may know that something is wrong. They may feel that they're struggling. They may be feeling that anxiety and that self-esteem, and actually knowing what the problem is might actually relieve some of that stress. So there are times when that conversation is actually helpful and actually can relieve some of that anxiety and that stress, because when you don't know what's wrong and you know that something is wrong, your imagination goes crazy. You don't know what this is, and you feel that adults may be hiding things from you. You know that you have appointments, you know that you have a therapist, you know that you have evaluations, you may need to take medication. You know something is wrong, but nobody's ever discussed it with you. That is very anxiety producing. And so that feeling of having a deep, dark secret is very frightening. So, you know, it goes both ways. And again, it's that judgment of when and how to do this.
Yeah, I mean, we see, I'm sure you've seen it as well. Kids who come to our school, and I'm sure this is true about any special education school. But kids who come to our school in 5th, 6th, 7th grade after years of it kind of not working out exactly in their previous school or schools, and then they come to us, and we're very open about, forget about again using the diagnosis, but we're very open about this is hard for you, or this is a strength of yours, and let's support you in this way, and this you can fly high on your own with, and really just kind of orienting themselves to their own learning style and to their own personalities sometimes, and it's eye-opening. Almost like they feel like it's the first time that they're in a place where they can feel comfortable in their own skin and understand themselves and why it is that they may be a little bit different. But why it doesn't really impact so much, because really they are, the special person that they are. And so I agree with you, right? It's oftentimes the exact opposite of what parents think, and not actually damaging their self-esteem. It's actually, if anything, empowering and strengthening them. So, our experiences with parents are wide and deep. And we've also, found that sometimes when we have parents who come to us in much later years, I'll say high school generally, and they haven't shared with their child their diagnosis, or again, even speaking to their child about what it is that makes them unique, their challenges and their strengths. Well, when it does come out and their kid does figure it out, either because they're still in that special ed school, or they're still working with that therapist, or somebody used the word autism or learning disability, or all of a sudden it becomes a huge traumatic event. Maybe traumatic is a strong word. In some cases, I think actually it's not a strong word, but if it's not traumatic, it's very definitely dramatic. It's, why have you been lying to me all these years? Why don't you tell me? I knew something was off. And that causes a really significant challenge all those years later, when it really it wasn't necessary, for that to happen. I don't know if Mrs. Rothschild, I don't know if you've experienced that at all with any of your students.
Absolutely. Yes. Or the children feel very betrayed when that happens, because their parents have known something all this time and didn't share it with them. They feel very deceived. And to do it in that way, to make it, to hide it for years and then come out with it suddenly, I don't think traumatic is such a strong word. I've seen that happen. I guess, one thing to think about in this area is what if the child takes medication? I've seen parents who don't want to tell the child what that medication is for. And again, you end up with that situation where the children feel like, you've been lying to me. That I've been doing this for years and you don't tell me what it's about. You're hiding this from me. It's a very, very uncomfortable feeling.
Yeah. Were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
Okay. And we find the opposite also. We've found parents who kind of are quite an open book and tell their children everything and explain, in their own way, everything that's written in this evaluation and why we're going to this doctor and why you're taking this pill. And sometimes it's just a little bit too much,
Right.
right? And we have found sometimes children coming to us who have grown up with that kind of language and sophistication about who they are. And, everything that they don't want to do in this world is blamed on their diagnosis. I have autism, so I can't clean up my room, or being a little silly. But there are probably better examples of that. And you can't expect me to read this. I have dyslexia. Well, actually, you can read that, and you read it last week. Let's just go over it one more time. And so there has to be this kind of balance. Which obviously we're promoting tonight, and we hope to be able to explain a little bit more. Why we don't want to wait all the way to the end, but we don't want to give too much information in the beginning.
Right. I think we're describing extremes, Rabbi Rothwachs. I think we're not going to do it at age 3, but we're not going to wait till age 18 either. We're not going to do it all at once as having hidden it for years and years. But on the other hand, we're not going to give all the information right at the beginning. I think we're aiming for something in the middle. I think it's very, very important to talk to children about their strengths and their weaknesses, and not to ignore the strengths. Look for those strengths. They might not be academic, but it's really important to have the conversation in the context of these are things you do well. These are things that you are really good at, and then there are things you need to work on, and those are things that you can be open with the child about, even at a younger age. You can think about what the diagnosis is, how much it impacts your child, what their age is, what their level of comprehension is, and you use descriptive language, not labels at the beginning, where you are describing, those child's strengths, like I said, within that context, and they don't need to know the word. You use the word autism, Rabbi Rothwachs, so don't use the word autism, but you can say things like, you're a really good math student, your handwriting is beautiful, and you're not so great at understanding people's tones of voice, whether they're angry or happy with you. And that's something that a child can understand in the context of these are goals. These are things I need to work on. You look like you're going to jump in. Go ahead.
No, I'm glad with it where this conversation is going, because I really do want to get into exactly this, tips for our parents and things that they should be thinking about. So that's certainly one thing in terms of describing, the whole person, right? Describing the challenges, of course, but also, the wonderful things that the child has to offer, whether that means, in terms of friendships or their role in the family, or academically, or in any other way. Those are, really, really important points. Yeah, I think another important point that parents should think about when they're having this conversation is, it's not all or nothing, right? We don't have to share everything at once. In fact, if you're having a conversation, forget about disabilities, you're having a conversation about, how plants grow, with your child. So, a 3-year-old, you might say something like, yeah, the Hashem gives us, the water and the sun, and something magical happens, and the grass grows, the flowers grow, right? And then when a child is, 8 years old or 9 years old, you might say a little bit more. And then when they get to, AP biology, they're learning about chlorophyll, I think is what it's called, and all of the other wonderful things that's chemically is happening inside. And that we weren't lying to the child when they were 3 years old that, what was really happening. It's just that each child at their own level can understand only so much. And so I think we need to tell ourselves as parents, when we're having these conversations, this is going to be multiple conversations over many, many years. And it's okay. We could do a little bit by a little bit, and then kind of cycle back and talk about that same point from a deeper, perspective as the child gains, perspective. That's something to be expected. It's not when you go back and have that conversation a year later, a month later, it's not because you failed. It's because the child's in a different place and they need to hear it in a little bit of a different way.
And think about how much less traumatizing that is. because it's just part of the conversation. If you've had that conversation at a young age and you come back to it a little bit later, it's just a continuation of something. It's not something that we're springing on the child, out of the blue. So I think that you diffuse a lot of that drama that you were describing earlier by having multiple conversations.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that parents can think a little bit about is, as kids get older, to make sure that there are supports in place for them outside of mom and dad and Abba and Ima, because as important as they are, we want our children as they get older to seek advice from others and to learn from others. And we want to make sure that the proper supports are in place. So again, this is not something you would do with a 3-year-old, but as kids get older and there are supports, natural supports in school for them, whether they're a school psychologist or a social worker or an administrator or a teacher, whoever that right person is, to say, you know what, this is also somebody else that you can talk to about, because I know you, little Zevi, are having trouble with this, or you're really good at that, but Mrs. So-and-so in school, she works with lots of different children. I think she might be able to help you with that, and kind of just, normalize it there. This is a conversation we could have with a lot of other people.
I think that point about supports is really important for parents also, to find supports for themselves. I think this is not easy. It's not an easy conversation to have, but it's not an easy position to be in. And those supports that you mentioned, we need the child to be aware and to be able to find his or her own supports, but parents also do. And I think, what you mentioned, through the school or through a support group or through a physician, there are many, many places to find that support. But if you don't know the right words, that's a good place, to have that conversation before you talk to your child also.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of this is and we'll come, I'm sure, back to this point, but we have to believe what we're saying as parents, and sometimes we have to get help to believe what we want to believe, right? But if really deep down you're mourning, you're really still so disappointed that your child hasn't reached particular milestones, or that they may present as being behaviorally out of control, or it's embarrassing, and if you're still so struggling with all that, it's very hard to say. And to be clear, I'm not judging anybody who is struggling with that. It's part of the process, and that's what Hashem intended for us. But it's a process. So we grow from that, and we need to be able to really believe in our heart of hearts that when we're telling a child, you have so much to offer in this world. Reading is difficult for you, or making eye contact is difficult for you. We'll figure that out. But what an amazing friend you are. Right? Or how good you are in math. That's fantastic. And we really, not just convincing them, but we need to be able to believe that ourselves as the adults in these children's lives first, before we communicate.
Correct.
I think one of the things when I think about our experiences with working with parents, and specifically on this topic, is that we never want to ask our children to keep secrets.
Correct.
Right? Keeping secrets in general, just in terms of, general child safety, is not a good idea. We always want children to feel comfortable and safe talking to the good adults in their lives about whatever is in their mind. And so we don't want to say to a child, listen, you have a learning disability, but don't tell anybody. Or even if we don't use the word learning disability, reading is really difficult, but let's keep that a secret. Don't tell anybody. So it makes it as a very shameful experience to be that child. And so we want to really, as much as we can, try to normalize any kind of set of circumstances or situation where there are lots of different people in this world, children and adults, who have different kinds of struggles, and to point to different people. And ultimately, that will be in our children's best interest.
Yeah. I mean, I would just reiterate that, because keeping secrets puts tremendous pressure on anyone, but on a child in specific. And to walk around knowing this and having to keep it a secret is very, very challenging. So I definitely agree with you.
Um, we've touched on a lot of practical suggestions for our parents in terms of finding a network, kind of normalizing, highlighting that people have lots of different profiles out there, different kinds of challenges. We also want to prepare our children for the future, meaning from their own perspective. And ultimately, it's hard for me to say at what age, like we spoke about in the beginning, but ultimately, they're going to need the language to be able to navigate the important decisions in their life in a meaningful way, and if practical for them in an independent way. So I'm wondering, kind of the conversations that you've had with parents and with children over the years in terms of using that kind of terminology, again, not with the 3-year-old, not with the 4-year-old, but at some point, maybe in middle school, beginning of high school, we're actually using those words when appropriate to be able to help them make sense of their own lives.
Yeah, I think one thing that's very important, you said this earlier, I'm going to come back to it again, is that we've seen children with the same diagnosis on paper who present very differently. And that's something very important for children to hear and to know that if they do at the point where they are hearing those labels, and you mentioned middle school is a time of a lot of change. Kids begin to question a lot of things, and these things tend to come up. In my experience, middle school is a time when a lot of kids start saying, asking questions. Why do I have this? Why do I need speech therapy? Why do I have to, be in this school? There are a lot of questions at that age, and they do at some point need that terminology. But there's this almost a stigma where they've heard that word in a different context about someone specific, and now they're going to associate that with that child, and they don't want to be associated with that. They don't want to be considered in that category, and that is very, very difficult. So one of the things that I in my conversations with kids, I definitely talk about the fact that these words are very, very broad, and there are many, many different things that go into that category. So if you use the word learning disability, there are so many different presentations of learning disabilities. And it doesn't mean that you're here or here or here or here. Everyone is an individual, and always in the context of strengths, always in the context of, things that we're working on, and that balance between the strengths and the challenges.
Yeah, I think what we have to, one of the things that might help us as parents when we're having these conversations or preparing for these conversations with children is to think about how the words that will be coming out of our mouth, an explanation to these children, how it will actually practically be helpful to this child. So to just use a diagnosis like we spoke about isn't necessarily so helpful. But I'm thinking about some of our high school students where as children get older, sometimes, depending on their profile, sometimes the gap can get wider between where they are and where their peers are. And that prompts lots of wondering, questions, frustration. And just as an example, we have, children who might be graduating high school and all their peers are going to study in Israel for a gap year. And for this particular child, it's not the right thing. And so everybody else is going there, and this child is not. So, to sit down for the first time when they're 17, 18 years old and say, it's just, you're different, you're in a different school, you need different things, you're just different. So that's not so helpful, right? But when we can circle back to conversations that we've had over the years and say, remember how we said that, sitting in a chair for a really long time, listening to one person talk is really hard. Well, that's what happens in a lot of these yeshivot or seminaries, as an example. Or remember we spoke about that, it's really hard for you to kind of stay organized and make sure that you are, staying safe. Could you imagine what it would be like 6,000 miles away and not necessarily being able to navigate from one place to another? But when we have those conversations and we can refer back, to you remember when we spoke about, so it kind of normalizes it. Oh, then, of course, that next step doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense for me. So I know I'm oversimplifying it. This is, I'm not talking about a particular child, and this is a, relatively brief webinar on a relatively complicated topic. But I think that it's helpful for parents to.
Yeah. I want to add one piece to that, and that is what we keep coming back to, is that if you're going to have those conversations, and especially that one the example that you gave about going to Israel, where the child really feels excluded, and everyone else is doing something, and it's not an option for them, is to put those supports into place before you have that conversation. To circle back to conversations you've had in the past within the context of strengths, but also to put the emotional support, because this is a very emotional conversation. It's not just an intellectual conversation of understanding myself. There's a lot of emotion here, and to put those supports into place in advance before we have that difficult conversation.
Yeah, and also, so number one is kind of circling back to those conversations, making sure the support's in place. But also normalizing that really, when you take a step back, it's hard as a teenager to see this, but as adults, we can, you take a step back and you realize all the different people that live in your world, all the different people that go to your shul, all the different people you see in the supermarket, they're really all very different from one another. And
right.
We put ourselves in a very small box, often, certainly in the, in the observant Jewish world, where everybody's kind of expected to take the same steps as everybody else, but it's not always the case. I think about sometimes I don't know why I'm thinking about a lot of high school examples right now, but we think about getting a driver's license. So it's a rite of passage. Okay, so for some students that might not be okay. Well, you know what? There are so many people in this world. If you live in Manhattan, probably not necessarily don't have a driver's license, because plenty of people who have disabilities or who don't have disabilities actually get around this world in lots of different ways, right? And so to just normalize, not everybody does what your neighbors do. There's actually a whole world out there, and people navigate this world and proceed from stage to stage in lots of different ways.
That's so important, Rabbi Rothbach, because kids, especially those older ages, tend to see everybody else is one huge box and I am excluded by myself. And that's not true. As you said, everyone is an individual, and there are so many people out there who do so many different things. The kids don't have that perspective. That's our job as the adults in their lives to help them see that perspective.
Right. Now, to be clear, most children, regardless of disability or not, most children don't have that perspective.
Correct.
That's not their job in this world.
Right.
Their job is to want to be like everybody else, but we want to help them grow up and realize that really everybody's so different from one another. I think that just circling back to go a little bit deeper on one of the points we made earlier, because this conversation is making me think a little bit about the parents' own perspectives and their own beliefs. In order for children to be able to hear all that we're talking about, in a positive way from parents, parents not only need to believe it, but there has to be, it's helpful for there to be a conversation in the house that normalizes these kind of conversations. So just as an example, if a parent knows that sometime over the next month or 2 or 3, they really want to talk to their child about how difficult it is to, sit still, right? And so therefore they might be taking some medication. But you're trying to figure out exactly how to speak about that. So it's helpful for that parent to reflect in just kind of matter-of-fact ways, like, today I just had such a hard time concentrating. I was sitting in this seminar. There was this webinar at 8 o'clock at night Rabbi Rothbach was talking at, and it was just, I was waiting for it to get over, right? So but to be able to, I'm being a little silly now, but it's able for all the parents, for all of the children to hear the parents say, you know what? Like we all struggle with things. And then now 3 months later, when you're talking about that one thing that that child struggles with, so like, listen, remember I was telling you, like, I struggle with it and I struggle with that, and mommy struggles with this and struggles with that. So this is your piece. And so there has to kind of be this normalization of how people are different, and not only people out there, but even people in our house are different from one another.
Yes, absolutely. And that there are many paths to success. There are many definitions of success. And it's not all one road, and you either, follow along or fall off. There are many, many different ways to accomplish in this world. And kids need to see that and to understand.
Some of our parents, not all, but some of our parents who have been successful in this kind of conversation with their kids bring a little bit of a theological spin, to this. And we've been talking really mostly from a kind of social perspective. What the norm is out there. I have challenges. So and so has challenges. Not everybody has the same path. But sometimes our parents, approach us from a perspective of Hashem created this world with lots of different people in it. Hashem wants it to be that everybody has different strengths and different challenges so that we can complement one another, may even look to some of our great Ishei HaTanach or our Gedolim. We'll look at it and see, this one had this disability or this diagnosis, and look how great they became. So I'm actually, curious to hear from you, Mrs. Rothschild, to the degree that you feel like that has been helpful for the parents that that have used that or not.
It's definitely been helpful to parents. It's that normalization that you're talking about. And it makes you feel, from that perspective, Hashem has a plan for everybody. And whatever challenges he's given us, and he's given us all challenges of one sort or another. And we may encounter them in childhood, we may encounter them later on in our lives. But when you have, like you said, children don't have this perspective. This is an adult perspective, being able to look at the world in that way and to understand that Hashem really does have some plan for everybody. I will tell you that with some of our middle school students, this really resonates. It's very comforting. It's very comforting to think Hashem has a plan, and he created me the way I am, and that's the way I'm supposed to be, and that's okay. And for some students, that is a very, very comforting conversation that kind of empowers and uplifts them.
Yeah, it's very freeing.
Yes.
You could think about as adults when we have to remind ourselves of those kinds of things, right? Somebody's sick in our family or going through whatever trouble, to be able to take a step back and say, this is Hashem's plan, right? I am in His hands. That doesn't mean I don't have any control. And Hashem wants us to, be masters of our destiny in that way and to control our lives. But ultimately, we're in Hashem's hands, and that it's actually freeing, because we don't get so anxious about what are we doing, what are we not doing. Right? It's just like we're doing our best, and Hashem has our back. And just as adults, that can be very, very comforting and freeing, and allows us to kind of focus on all the other important things in our lives. And the same thing is true for our children.
Yeah, it can take some of that stress off.
Yeah. I really enjoyed tonight's talk. We're not quite over just yet. We do have some questions and answers to get to. Well, definitely have questions. I hope we have some answers. Well, I guess time will tell. But I hope that our chevra that's joining us tonight was able to learn a little bit about some of what we've discussed tonight, and be able to guide in their own way, take some of the pieces of information that we've shared, and be able to apply at least one or two things to their own lives. So I'm going to share some questions and answers, some questions that have come up. I can't promise that we're going to be able to get to all of them, But since I have access to the questions and Mrs. Rothschild doesn't, I'm gonna ask the question, but I don't mean to put you on the spot. We'll figure it out together. So here is one question. What's the best way to talk to siblings about their brother or sister with special needs? How do you best explain why that child behaves differently or goes to a different school? Great question. We spent a lot of time talking about the parent-child relationship, but there's more dynamics. So, Mrs. Rothschild, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's very similar to how we speak to the child himself or herself about the issues. We don't want to traumatize anybody. We also don't want to tell siblings things that the child themselves don't know. We don't want to tell them, your brother has autism, but don't tell him. Again, you're putting pressure on the sibling to keep a secret, and you're also keeping the secret from the child themselves, and they're going to sense that, and it's going to be very hurtful when they find out that everybody else in the family knew and they didn't. So again, I think it's a very similar model. I think you look at where the siblings are up to in their development. Think about the context of strengths and weaknesses. I think a very open approach where we all know we're all on the same page, we're all helping each other. And to be honest, the siblings probably have things they need to work on too. So that conversation does not have to be limited to this child. This is a family conversation. You mentioned the parents have things to work on, so do the siblings. And so the context can be a very open discussion of things we need to work on.
Yeah, as you were thinking, I asked you the question, but if I were to have asked myself the questions, I would have said the same thing, but my orientation would have been, what do we do in school with different children in the same class, where sometimes someone says, it's not fair. Why does that child get extra time or somebody to write for them? Or why don't you get that child in trouble when and to be able to have the conversation and say, everybody's got their thing. Right. And let's focus on ourselves. But if you want to be able to understand your peer, or in this case, to be able to understand your child, your sibling, here's some information to be able to make it. But we've all got our things. So,
right.
Okay, well said. Wow, this is an interesting question. Is there a time when, regardless of what the child's reaction might be, a child must know what the diagnoses are specifically? What about siblings or other family members, grandparents, other close relatives? Is there ever a time when they must know? What do you think, Mrs. Rothschild?
That's a great question. I think there might be a time when they must know, but I don't think it's going to be the same for everyone. And I don't think it's when they're young. I think that there might be a time when they need to advocate for themselves, and they really do need to know what their documentation says. And so there may be a point where they just need to know the words so that they can get the help that they need, or they can somehow fill out legal paperwork. Or, there are all different things that happen when they're a little bit older. The part about siblings and family, I think it really depends. I like that model of openness, but on the other hand, that could create a lot of tension. What are your thoughts, Rabbi Rothweiss?
Yeah, I think sometimes, especially grandparents, when they spend time with their family and everybody's enjoying each other, and this one child is bouncing off the wall and causing trouble, it could be very frustrating. All they wanted is, all the children to get along, and now somebody's walking out crying, and it happens time after time. So I think sometimes we need to, have a heart-to-heart with grandparents as well. And again, you don't have to share everything. You don't even have to share the diagnosis, right? Going full circle back to the beginning of our conversation, but to be able to give them some of the words to be able to understand why it is that the grandchild might be struggling. But I don't think in those cases they have to know the diagnosis, if that's something.
I think that, think about the sandwich generation. The parents will then be caught between explaining it to their children and explaining it to their parents. It becomes very tricky. And I know that the dynamics can be very difficult. So again, I don't think, like you said, I don't think there's a time where they have to know. I think that if it feels like it would be helpful for them to know, then it is definitely appropriate to discuss it. But I don't think everything needs to be shared.
Right, I think that's right. You know, we spoke before about how we all need our supports, and certainly parents of children with special needs need supports. And sometimes that's their parents or the parents' siblings. You know, sometimes those are the people that they go to, and that's wonderful. But it's also okay if those are not the people in your life who are going to make your life easier. If you feel like they're going to be judgmental or they're going to be overbearing. Oh, see this doctor or read this article. This is it, and then that's not helpful. So you have like with everything else in life, you have to know what you're sharing with whom and try to make it in a way that that is most helpful. Okay, we'll try to get to a few more questions. The next question is, can you please give suggestions how to have this conversation with a child who doesn't think they need support, doesn't think that they're different or struggling, but the evaluations show that they do need services?
I have this conversation all the time. This happens. And especially as we, as adults, as educators and parents, want to protect a child's self-esteem, and we always tell them about their strengths, and we build them up, and we give them compliments, and they don't realize that they're actually struggling, that they're actually a little behind academically, that they're actually not behaving in a way that's socially acceptable, because we haven't shared that with them. So I think I've had these conversations where I say things like, have you ever noticed that when we're doing whatever it is, this is a struggle for you? And the child will say no. And I'll say, okay, well, I've noticed. And let me share some of my observations. And I start the conversation this way, without making any dramatic statements, without tapping into anybody's panic or anxiety, but just saying, let me share with you some of the things that I've observed or that your teachers have observed. And let's think about really how to work on those things and start the conversation. Because once we normalize it, like you described earlier, and it's not the first conversation anymore, it's a second and third and fourth conversation, they begin to understand where they need support, and it becomes normal to need support. Everybody needs support somewhere. And every kid in your class is going to need support, and your siblings are going to need, children growing up are going to need support somewhere. So we work on normalizing that. But that first conversation is always very interesting.
It's a lot of fun. That's true. Like we sometimes we do, when I say we, I don't mean just us at Sinai. I mean, educators and parents alike. Sometimes we do too good of a job at, helping our kids feel like they can do anything in this world. And really, that's not the case.
Right. It's not the case for any of us.
Yeah. Those are fun conversations to have. One of the questions here is, my child knows his diagnosis, but how do I respond to the question of, why do I have, this? It's a blank question, but autism or hearing impairment or learning disability. Why do I have that? Why me?
Mm.
So I'll jump in here. I think I'll go back to my theological point before, because this is really the only way to approach, I think, such a question. Again, depending on if the child is asking that question. So hopefully they're in a place to really be able to understand what I'm about to say. But if not, you might want to hold it off. There's actually somebody pointed out to me many years ago. Actually, I think it was Dr. Pelkovitz who explained to me once the difference between two Hebrew words for the word why. There's lama and there's madua. So oftentimes if there's some sort of tragedy or somebody dies suddenly, we say, why did this happen? So we don't ask madua, which means why did Hashem make this happen? Because if you ask that question, you'll never get a satisfying response, because ultimately we don't know the answer to why. We are just, simple human beings. But there is a question that we could answer, which is lama, lima, for what? And so I don't have control over what happened in the past, but I do have a control over lama, for what purpose? So this, I'm in this scenario. Now, what good am I going to make of this? Somebody, passed away suddenly. So what's that going to inspire me to do? What midos am I going to work on? What philos am I going to, try to perfect? So on and so forth. And I think, in a very different way, we can insert that kind of thinking into a response to a child. Again, if this is something you feel like they're developmentally up to. Why do you have a learning disability? Why do you have a physical disability? I don't know why Hashem created you like this. I do know Hashem created lots of different kinds of people. You are one kind of person. I'm another kind. Joe is another, and Sarah is another. But if you want to, maybe a better question is, now that Hashem has created me in this way, what do I do with that?
Right.
Right? Hashem wants me to do good in this world. He wants me to impact the world in a positive way. What am I going to do with it? With both the challenges that I have and, of course, the many strengths that I have. How am I going to create, good in this world? Again, you can't have that conversation with a 4-year-old, but hopefully, as children get older, they might be in a place where they can have that conversation. Okay, let's try to get to 1 or 2 more questions. What if your child doesn't have appropriate filtering and will tell every person he or she meets what the diagnosis is? How do you help the child understand the difference between sharing the diagnosis within the family with the understanding that sometimes things are kept private with regard to the rest of the world?
That's a great question.
Great
But it
question.
doesn't apply just to their diagnosis. If the child doesn't have a filter, it's going to be everything. So I think before I share with a child, if I know my child and I see that they have difficulty not sharing things with everybody, then I think I'm going to try to teach some of those skills first before I introduce the diagnosis and the word for it. I think that we'll leave that for a little bit later, and we can talk about challenges, but we can also practice what's private, what's I wouldn't use the word secret. Again, keeping secrets is very, very challenging and puts a lot of pressure on the child. But what things are private and what does it mean to keep things private? And I think that's a skill that we need to practice. And I think that we need to work on it. I think it takes time, but I think I wouldn't introduce the diagnosis at the point where the child really, really can't contain it.
I think we're going to do one more question. And if you jump at it quickly, I won't answer it. So. Okay, here we go. Here's the question. What if a child has expressed fear, even terror, of the idea that they, quote unquote, have the exact diagnosis they do have? What's the right answer to, I don't have that, right?
That's a really tough one. Sounds like you had an answer. Do you want to jump in first?
I think the question is probably better than my answer. I think that, again, this is part of zooming out and talking generally. So, you're scared of what it means to have such a diagnosis. Let's not even focus on that, right? Well, I'll answer your question if you have that or not. But let's look like, why is it, why does that scare you? Who do you know that has a diagnosis? What do you know about them? Do you know that they can actually do A, B, C, D, and E? Right? Like just kind of like zooming out a little bit and saying, not everything in this world is rosy, and we all have our struggles. But when we say that having autism means this, or a learning disability means that, or muscular dystrophy means that, I think that all of the other actually really wonderful things, qualities that these people have. So, the question is a very targeted, kind of pierce in your heart kind of question. I don't have that, right? You feel the need to not evade and to answer that question. And again, at a developmentally appropriate stage, she'll know whether to answer that question eventually in a direct way. But I think it's helpful to take a step back and say, well, what exactly are you afraid of?
Right.
Maybe it's not as bad as you think.
But also, I think that there's a lot of misinformation and kids jump to conclusions. They don't have a context. They don't understand. They're basing these questions on either someone that they know and they're looking at that person and drawing conclusions, or on things that they've heard that are scary. And sometimes just giving them real information about what these things mean is very helpful and can clarify. Like I said before, these categories are very broad. There are people with the same label, who are functioning at all different levels. And so sometimes just providing information will broaden that category and help the child understand. And you're right, I would not answer that directly at that first moment. You want to zoom out, like you said, and try to give it context and try to explain a little bit. Eventually, you're going to have to, but you hope that by the time you do, they have a little bit of a better understanding.
Okay, Mrs. Rothschild, thanks so much for joining me tonight. This was a lot of fun.
This
Not
was
sure
a lot of fun.
what you're doing tomorrow night, but maybe we could do something similar.
This was a pleasure.
Um,
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for your amazing questions. I'm only sad that we weren't able to get to all of them, but both Mrs. Rothschild and I are available to help answer your questions. Privately, feel free to send us an email or a call. You can get our information on our website, sinaischools.org. We'll try to send out a questionnaire to each of you tomorrow, and just to kind of get some feedback, and to help us plan Amir Hashem for another webinar series for next year. And you could also feel free to follow up with any questions that we didn't get to. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that this was helpful, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation together with all of you. Have a great night.
Thank you.